Okay, well, thank you so much, Linda, for being here with us. So, we are going to be interviewing Linda Hayes today, and she is a distinguished professor emerita at the University of Nevada, Reno. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Manitoba in Canada and her graduate degrees from Western Michigan University. She was a member of the behavior analysis faculty at West Virginia University while completing her doctorate, after which she returned to Canada, taking a position at St. Mary's University. Linda co founded the behavior analysis program at the University of Nevada, Reno. Beautiful campus, by the way. On a self capitalization model and served as its director for over a decade. She has received numerous awards for her contributions to the training of behavior analysts, including the Fred S. Keller Award for teaching of behavior analysis and APA's Division 25, an Outstanding Teacher Award from the College of Arts and Sciences at West Virginia University, a Distinguished Faculty Award from the University of Nevada, Reno, an Outstanding Faculty Award from the Board of Regents of the Nevada System of Colleges and Universities, an Outstanding Alumna Award from Western Michigan University, and for the program she founded, a SABA Award for Enduring Contributions to Behavior Analysis. Linda also founded UNR's satellite programs in behavior analysis, aimed at meeting the ever-growing demand for qualified practitioners in regions where appropriate training has been unavailable or inaccessible. Her efforts in this regard earned her a Global Engagement Award from the University of Nevada, Reno, and the SABA International Development Award. Linda is a fellow at the Association for Behavior Analysis International and has served 2 terms as its president. Linda's scholarly interests have ranged from the experimental analysis of animal behavior to the logic of science, and she is best known for her contributions to behavior theory and philosophy. So, you've done a lot, basically. You've been pretty busy throughout all these years. So, what we're doing in this section for the virtual Museum of Behavior Analysis is that we are commemorating 100 years of interbehavioral psychology. So we thought of interviewing different people who met Kantor personally, so that we can know about your perspective on, well, his perspective on psychology, and basically, so you can share with us a little bit about Kantor as a person, right? Uh, so let's start with our first question, which is how, when, and where did you meet Kantor?
I met him at Western Michigan University. I was a graduate student there, and I was taking a course on interbehavioral psychology from Professor Paul Mountjoy, who had been a student of Kantor's in Indiana. And in this class, as a result of this class, there was a very small number of people in that class where we read not Principles of Psychology, but rather we read The Aim and Progress of Psychology and Related Sciences, which was a collection of short articles that had been published in the Psychological Record and elsewhere over many years. And that was our textbook for the class. I did a paper in that class actually also on Kantor's and Objective Psychology of Grammar. So that was my first introduction to Kantor, was that class. But toward the end of the semester, and that was in 1975, toward the end of that semester, Paul Mountjoy invited Kantor to the campus. And he came to campus and he gave a talk, and he was the students who were in the class had an opportunity to talk to him afterwards and kind of have a conversation with him. And I was very, very impressed with his work. I had studied radical behaviorism, and I was a student of Jack Michael's at Western Michigan University. And Jack Michael was a Skinnerian and operant psychologist. He was a brilliant teacher, and what he was most known for is his analysis of Skinner's verbal behavior. And I was almost afraid to read Kantor's Objective Psychology of Grammar because I so loved Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, and I knew it very well. And anyway, I read Kantor's his book, and I really, it was written from a very different perspective, actually, than Skinner's, but it was also very, very interesting. They didn't really compete with one another because they were really quite so different, really. But then after that, Paul invited Kantor to a conference in 1976 in Chicago. It was the Midwestern Association for Behavior Analysis at that time. And Kantor gave a talk entitled Behaviorism, Behavior Analysis, and the Career of Psychology. And it was an absolutely fabulous talk. And it made so much sense to me. And but Skinner was in the audience, and Skinner stood up in the middle, at the end of his talk during the question period, and he said that that Kantor was a structuralist. He didn't really understand Kantor's position, and Kantor had put up this. A picture of the interbehavioral field, and you know what that looks like with all the two-sided arrows and and everything. And Skinner commented he didn't understand what that was all about. And it was sort of during that time that I don't think that Kantor said this in that session, but he said it right around this time that Skinner really only had one idea, and it was Thorndike's. So they were not each other's throats, but they had been in Indiana together, and they knew each other. And apparently, Kantor had invited Skinner to come to Indiana, thinking that Skinner would be the basic research guy. Because he had just written schedules of reinforcement, and he'd done all that, and Kantor would be the theoretical guy. But of course, when they got there, Skinner had just written Science and Human Behavior, and he wanted to be the theoretical guy, or he was working on that, and so that didn't work out very well. And then Skinner went to Harvard. But anyway, so they were kind of they didn't really appreciate each other, put it that way. So after hearing that talk and meeting Kantor, I started to correspond with him. So I would write him a letter about something, and I remember one of the first letters that I wrote to him had to do with reinforcement. What did he think about the concept of reinforcement? And Kantor replied that it's a setting factor. So I had to think about that. So I was already an operant psychologist, a Skinnerian. But I thought that Kantor's philosophical and broader conceptualizations would be of interest to the Skinnerians, because they didn't really have much of a philosophical treatment, really. It was kind of they had just kind of a logic of experimentation, and some sort of general ideas or assumptions about causality, but they didn't have a field notion, and they didn't really have a philosophical foundation that was in any way complete or adequate or structured. And so I thought interbehaviorism would be ideal for the radical behaviorists, But my advisor and the other students in his lab, which included me, and I would go there and I would talk about Kantor all the time, and they didn't like that, and they weren't interested in Kantor, and they would, they'd say things like, "Oh, there she goes again, talking about Kantor," and they just really didn't like it. And increasingly, I had started to read everything I could get my hands on of Kantor's, including Principles of Psychology. I did take one other class from this Paul Mountjoy, the person who had introduced me to Kantor, which was a history of psychology using Kantor's 2-volume history text. But I communicated with Kantor several times in letters, corresponded with him, and he always replied, and he was always always responded, which was great. And he invited me to go there to his house where we could have a longer discussion. So I was just overwhelmed with joy at that idea. And so my family lived in central Canada, and the way to get to central Canada was for me to get to Chicago, and then from Chicago fly to Winnipeg, Canada. And my home was near there. And so what I had arranged was that I would go to Chicago and visit with Kantor first, and then I would fly from Chicago home for Christmas. So that was my plan. And I can't remember, I think I took a bus from Kalamazoo from Western Michigan and Kalamazoo to Chicago. And because it was odd. I had a backpack that had some clothes for me to take to Winnipeg, but I had 2 briefcases. It was really, really cold, and I didn't have a proper gloves or anything. I had these 2 briefcases, and I had like a tape recorder, and I had a camera, and I had, various papers and books that I wanted to talk to Kantor about. And so I showed up at his house, and he lives right near he lived right near the University of Chicago, but it was kind of a bit of a rough neighborhood actually around the university. But he'd lived there for many, many years, and he lived with his daughter Helen. So I go to the door, and he's there at the door, and his so sort of sweet looking head. He was in his early 90s at this point, but he had kind of pinkish cheeks, and he smiled, and he seemed very happy to see me. And in the background, I said hello, and he said hello and everything. And in the background, his daughter came toward us at the door, invited me in. But she was speaking in such a loud voice. I was startled. I didn't know what to do. It sounded like she was yelling. And it turned out she was yelling because Kantor was very hard of hearing at that point.
Oh, okay.
She was speaking loud enough for him to hear. I was totally startled. And then, anyway, I got there right shortly before dinner time. So I sat at this little table with the 3 of us to have dinner. And during dinner, it was the same thing. Like we were sitting very close to one another, the small table, but she was screaming so that he could hear. Oh, seriously, I don't know. It was very odd. I'll just finish this little part because then I was helping, she was washing up the dishes and everything, talking to her. And I said, here I had all these briefcases full of everything, but I didn't have an alarm clock. And I said, I really feel terrible because we were going to get up the next morning and we were going to work all day. And I was going to spend one more night there. And I was afraid I was going to sleep in. I didn't have an alarm clock. That would be awful. And I said, I didn't have an alarm clock. Could I borrow something? And she said, you'll wake up. I thought, no, I won't. What if I don't wake up? So anyway, I go to sleep. The next morning, the radio came on.
Oh.
Loud. So anyway, those are my stories about the sort of odd first introduction. But we then spent the next day And the way it worked is we went down to his office, which was extraordinary. It was like being in a library, because there were all these library shelves around it, journals from, the last 80 years or so. And then there was this big sort of horseshoe table. And at the table, there would be a station where it was obviously he was doing some writing, and there would be some papers and some books. And then there'd be another place on the table with some other collection of stuff. And these were things that he was working on. So he would work on this with these pieces, and then he'd move down to something else. So there's like 4 or 5 different things around this table that he was working on. Well, what we did is we sat together, and he wore a headset, and I spoke through a microphone into a speaker, and then it played in so that he could hear.
Oh, okay.
He was plugged into the speaker, so it was kind of a roundabout way. But with that, we could have a normal conversation. So I could talk, and he could hear me, and he could talk, and of course I could hear. So we had a long conversation that day about a whole bunch of things, and 2 in particular that I remember. In looking at the field, as Kantor looked at it, there were a couple of issues that I was curious about. And one was the concept of the setting. And what he had written about the setting is that the setting, which particular function, stimulus response function, occurred depended on the setting. And the setting could facilitate or hinder particular, whatever, different functional relations showing up. And I didn't really like that, because I didn't like the idea that the setting made something happen. Because it was kind of I didn't think there was room in the field notion for that. And I suggested that the setting was part of the event, not something that made something happen. And he thought about that, and we talked about that for a fair amount. And the other thing that we talked about quite a bit was history, the idea of history. And in his work, psychological events are historical events. But there was a notion that there was a history, and that it had gone by. And now we're in the present. And for me, it seemed that if the history had to be present in order for it to be present, in order for it to have some place. And so I said that I thought the history had to be in the present circumstance. And I think, and he agreed with these things, actually. And so it wasn't like I changed his mind or anything about these things, but those are the things we discussed. And in my own career and in my own thinking over all this time, I still find those issues to be critically important to understanding the concept of a field. And the way he talked about it, the way he talked about setting factors suggests this, because he says that even though he talks about hindering and facilitating, he says that the factors that make up the setting they're not just a bunch of stuff. They are things that are organized into a pattern. And if you change a factor, that reorganizes into a different setting. But he also said that the things that are present, the things that are there and being organized, have been have participated in functional functions in the past. They were the factors were historical in that sense. They had been sources of stimulus functions for that organism previously. So that means he's saying that the setting is the history. The history is in the setting. And that still, I think, is a really complicated issue. And of course, history has always been, people are always making something up about history, it makes you do this and it's stored inside. And, I don't know, there's all kinds of interpretations of history that haven't worked, that haven't been very effective. And of course, Skinner's notion of history is that it's stored,
Mm-hmm.
so, he doesn't like to say it's stored, but frankly, that's what the analysis is. You're a new organism responding in new ways. Well, that's a storage model. Anyway, those were the kinds of things we talked about. And then after that, we kept communicating, and several times, on the way to ABA, which was the MABA at the time, Midwestern Association of Behavior Analysis. That conference was often in Chicago for the first few years. And so I would always stop and see him. And one time that I stopped there, and I had another student with me, and Emilio was there.
Oh, okay.
And Emilio and I knew each other because Emilio had come to Western Michigan to give a talk too, sort of around the same time in the sort of early to late 70s, mid to late 70s period. And Emilio and I knew each other, and we both were interested in Kantor's work. And Emilio had a longer term interaction with Kantor and continued to have, Kantor had gone to Mexico and visited and that sort of thing. But I remember that time because Emilio was talking to Kantor about contingencies. And he wasn't talking about reinforcement contingencies. He was talking about if-then relationships, Mm-hmm. And I remember Kantor saying, contingencies, contingencies, contingencies. He had a funny voice. Emilio might remember that event. But anyway, it was just a brief meeting, So, and so whenever I got a chance, I would talk to him, I would stop by, and we continued to correspond too. So it was it was a great time for me. Late, very late in his life. In the evenings when I was there, we walked around the block, sort of where he was in the neighborhood, and he had kind of a little walker. And he had in the evening he called it his constitutional. That was his little constitutional walk. And in the evening, he had one glass of vodka with cranberry juice.
Mm-hmm. Interesting choice.
Yeah. So it was very sweet being there with him. And here I had a tape recorder and I had a camera and everything else. And I felt that it would be improper to tape him. And so I didn't tape anything. And I thought, it would be improper to just take advantage of him, to take a bunch of pictures. So I didn't do that either. So now I don't have any pictures of Kantor and I. Which I wish I had taken one picture at least. But
sure. Yeah, don't worry. We'll create one or something. We'll find a way to make a picture. Okay. All right. That's very interesting. So you did mention that the book that you were reading first was The Aim of Science. But when did you first learn about principles of psychology?
Right around that period. As soon as I was in that class and I started to know what Kantor was doing, I got the principles of psychology and had started reading that right around that same time. It'd be 1975, 1976, around then.
Okay. All right. So how have Kantor and this book in particular, Principles of Psychology, influenced your career and psychology in general?
Yes. Well, I couldn't get anybody at Western Michigan University in this, the hub of Skinnerian thinking, to want to study Kantor, or want to know more about Kantor, or want to see how it might relate to Skinner's work. And so when I got an opportunity, I was working for ABA as a corresponding secretary. I had a job as a graduate student. So I was working with them. And what it meant was that I ended up going to a meeting of the council, the executive council of APA. This is sort of the executive group. And I went to a meeting, and there was somebody there by the name of John Craffle, and he was the chair of the psychology department at West Virginia University, which was another behavioral program at the time. And John Craffle was a systems analyst. He was a really broad thinker, but he was also very interested in philosophy. I got to talking to him about all of this, and he said, "Well, why don't you come to West Virginia?" And so I was still pursuing my degree at Western Michigan, but John Craffle said, "Well, if you come here, you can I can give you a visiting graduate assistantship." So I went to West Virginia. I still had my comprehensive exams to do and my dissertation. But when I got to West Virginia, he had set it up so that I would give a seminar to graduate students and faculty on inner behaviorism. So I had a great time there. And then I stayed there, and I became a visiting, and I got my degree from Western over a period of time. I studied while I was in West Virginia, got my degree from Western Michigan, and my dissertation was on a reinterpretation of behavioral science in terms of Kantor's position. It was a theoretical dissertation, and I just never looked back. I mean, I taught Skinner's work for a long time as because I thought that some of that was important for some applied and some basic research kinds of things. It was a good foundation, but I've pretty much always after that point been an interbehaviorist.
True. And were there any reasons? I'm kind of, going to ask more about what you just said. What did the people in your lab that rejected learning more about inner behaviorism give any reasons on why they didn't like it?
They didn't like the field notion. They thought it was not. I mean, everybody who doesn't like a field notion likes causality a whole lot.
True.
So they were kind of linear causal thinkers like Skinner. And so the field notion seemed impotent. It seemed like, what could you do with it? You couldn't, it didn't have, these are sort of, these are ignorant kinds of thoughts about inner behaviorism, that there's no application for it, and there's no research, no research, no methodology. Those are those are misunderstandings. Research is research. Change something, you see what happens. You can do that from an inner behavioral perspective as from any other perspective. But that was a very popular criticism of inner behaviorism. It couldn't do this, couldn't do that. But I found myself in an environment where it was appreciated, and I got a chance to teach, and I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the colleagues there, and then when I finally graduated, I went to Canada, back to Canada, to a university in Halifax. And when I was there, again, I taught radical behaviorism and interbehaviorism. And then when I came to Reno, I did the same thing. I taught both radical behaviorism, including Skinner's verbal behavior, and about behaviorism, and beyond freedom and dignity, all of those, and interbehaviorism. I've had a lot of students who, I think anybody who's taken a class from me has gotten some interbehaviorism in the class. So there's a lot of students over a lot of years, but a lot of people find themselves in a different domain, and they don't realize that interbehaviorism would be a great benefit in those domains. So.
True. And how did your students take it when you were just starting to speak about behaviorism in your classes?
Well, I tried to talk about, I taught Skinner's work, and I wasn't, just trying to trash everything Skinner said at every point. I mean, why was I teaching it then if I thought it was that useless? But there were certain things that I thought Skinner had not done very well, and I started to point some of those out. And a lot of them had to do with substitution. It had to do with substitute stimulation. So all of Skinner's notion was that, we're studying rats and pigeons or whatever, and we're going to build this up, and it's going to get more complicated, and then we're going to be able to understand more complicated things, and it's all going to add up eventually. But we hadn't yet added it up to some of the most complex kinds of human behavior, like thinking and imagining and remembering. And I didn't think Skinner's analyses of these issues were adequate. And so I started really kind of showing where radical behaviorism had not yet developed. It was sort of dropping the ball on certain things, and the physiologist of the future was going to tell us about stuff, and remembering, it just kind of had to be there, and these analyses were not adequate, and nobody was doing any research on private events because they were private, and so how could you do any research on private events? Well, so when I was arguing, well, they're not private. There's no psychological event going on inside the organism. So it was, I guess the students that I've worked with over the years can identify some of the points where Skinner's analysis had not done adequately. It was not adequate for certain kinds of more complex human behavior, and also not that the philosophical system hadn't been developed. And I think people appreciated that. But then when they moved out to, do clinical work or something, they kind of shifted sort of back into kind of a more causal perspective.
Okay.
Yeah. Not all of them. I have some good interbehavioral progeny out there.
Yeah, I guess anyone who starts as a radical behaviorist and kind of transitions or shifts into, behaviorism has some sort of, I don't know if we should call it like an issue or like some sort of, it's because it's basically a decision almost to change. I mean, and it definitely changes the whole perspective that you have on behavior.
Yeah.
On how it naturally works. All right. So, oh, and it's also interesting because from what I understood, basically Kantor at some point chose or tried to collaborate with Skinner. Did I get that right?
Yeah, in Indiana. Kantor was there, and he invited Skinner to come but he thought that Skinner was going to be the basic research guy.
Mm-hmm.
And Skinner was wanting to be theory guy, like science and human behavior, and talk about culture and, all of that sort of thing. And so it didn't really work out. And and I think what I heard from Bill Verplank was I think he was a lecturer at Indiana when Skinner and Kantor were there. And he told the story, this might be written somewhere, but he also told a story at a conversation hour that was scheduled at ABA one year about how Kantor and Skinner were courteous to one another, but their students fought with one another.
Oh, okay.
Their students fought with Kantor's students. and he also told another tale about Kantor there that Kantor would teach class, even if there was only like one student in the class, and he'd stand up and give his lectures just to one student or two students or whatever. And I could just imagine him doing that, not change it, make it a discussion or anything, just do a formal lecture. So I don't know that I think there was an idea that they were both behaviorally oriented and they could surely work together and build a program, but their views were just a little bit were different on the fundamental issue of causality, which is always the issue, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so it's a small, big difference.
Yeah.
The causal part. Okay. All right. Now for our next question, which one of Kantor's proposals and principles of psychology do you consider to be the most important for psychology today?
I think the concept of implicit action as responses to absent stimuli, which is, I wrote it down here, chapter 10, volume 1 of Principles of Psychology. I think that concept of substitution is critical in understanding language, understanding all kinds of complex behavior. And what is interesting about it is that there is no concept like that in Skinner's behaviorism. He kind of says a few things in verbal behavior that sort of sound like that, but it's not really a fundamental issue. And that's why all of those complex behaviors couldn't really be properly understood, because that critical concept was missing. And I think that, it's that concept that was kind of discovered by, Sigmund, it was discovered in RFT and it's discovered in other things. It's that concept. It's that important. So I think, and I've found myself working on that issue for most of my career.
Okay. All right. Now for our last question, can you share your best memory of Kantor with us? And that can be something that you experienced with him, or maybe some other personal stories that he told you.
Well, I talked a lot earlier on about my experiences with him, and I can't really pick out something that's my best experience with him. At one point, he had the psychological record was his journal. He had started that journal and had it had been maintained with an interbehavioral orientation from the outset. And when the editor, whose name I can't remember right now, was going to leave, they were looking for a new editor. And Kantor asked me if I would. Kantor told me in correspondence with him that he had recommended me as an editor. And there were a lot of old guys around Kantor. And they thought the way he put it was, they said that I hadn't had enough birthdays. In other words, I was too. And I found that to be, what I found about that was that it was very, I felt really acknowledged by him. So I wouldn't say that's my very best interaction with him. It's a memorable one because, of course, I never was the editor of the psych record.
Yeah.
But it was a nice acknowledgement.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting then. Thank you so much. Well, in that case, that would be the end of this interview. Thank you, Linda.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'll talk to you again soon.
Sure.
All right.